So, Jill, should we start with the introductions?
Sure. Welcome everyone to the second to the last lecture in our lecture series on wind and wildlife interactions. Welcome back to those of you who are returning participants. To those of you who are new, I am Jill Schaefer and I am here with Todd Katzner. We're scientists from the U.S. Geological Survey. We are working with the Association for the Conservation of Biodiversity of Kazakhstan, specifically with Yenlik and Alyona, on behalf of the U.S. Embassy to bring you this series of lectures. We would very much like to thank ACBK for hosting these lectures and the presentations and related materials. All past lectures, and as well as this one, the recordings are available on the ACBK website, which that URL, the URL, will be put in the chat. Todd and I would like to thank Chevron for funding the translation of these lectures. And we specifically like to thank Sophia, who does an excellent job in translating both the presentations and the verbal part of our lectures. Just a reminder that the last lecture in the series will occur on March 12th. Todd and I will be providing a summary of the main topics of the past lectures, discussing some of the most common best management practices. We will as well be including new information on mapping, a mapping topic based on feedback from past participants of lectures. Today, however, Todd and I are thrilled to be able to present our 7th lecture, and Todd is going to present to you, introduce you to our lecturer. Todd?
Thanks very much, Jill. It's great to be here again, and it's really exciting to be able to introduce to you Jennifer Miller from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Jennifer is the chief for the branch of permits and regulations within the Migratory Birds Program of the Fish and Wildlife Service. Her branch is responsible for administering regulation and policy for the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, as well as the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act. And the regulations she administers span everything from energy development, research, wildlife damage, education, captive breeding, falconry, taxidermy, and cultural use. Jennifer has also been a permits branch chief in a regional office. Now she's the big boss for all the offices, and she's really good at her job. I've known her for a number of years, and I always appreciate being able to work with her. Jennifer has a bachelor's degree from Penn State University, a master's of science from North Carolina State University, and has studied hippopotamus in Africa. So I think without further ado, Jennifer currently resides. She lives in Portland, Oregon, with her family. I'm excited about today's lecture because this is something completely unique. It's something I don't know a lot about, but it's a really, really important component of wind energy development. So without any further ado, Jennifer, please take it away.
Thanks, Todd. I'm really excited to be here and talking about this topic. Regulations are something that isn't always super exciting when you see the title of a lecture, but it is something I'm really passionate about, and I really love the work that I do And I love it because it's a chance to help people. It's really fun puzzles to figure out how to put together information in new ways, collect new information, be creative, but ultimately how to help people so that we can better help wildlife. And it's a really unique way to use some skills to figure out how to help, which is what I like to do. All right. So the goal of today is to introduce approaches and considerations for regulation writing. I have kind of two parts. One is a little bit more just what is the background of law, regulation, policy, and guidance that helps understand how regulation fits into the framework of information a government shares to help get behaviors that they want. Also, I want to get into a little more detail in the second part about how to write regulations and policy in a meaningful way, and a new perspective perhaps into how to approach those. There has been some changes in the US government in the past 20 years in how to approach regulation writing. And with that, I feel like some really great changes have come about and want to share some new perspectives and approaches there. As Todd said, I work with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. That's a government agency which has authority to implement a number of wildlife laws. This includes two that I work with, which is the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, as well, and the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act. I will apologize. I'm very accustomed now to using those acronyms of MBTA, which refers to the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and the Eagle Act, for the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act, as those titles both get pretty long and cumbersome. So I will probably be using shorthand for those. I will try very hard not to use shorthand for anything else. The other one that's really common that people have heard of is the Endangered Species Act. And that's not one that my branch covers, but it is another one that our agency covers and does interface with some of the work we do. I work with the Migratory Birds Program, which is inside the agency. And then within that, I'm in charge of the branch of regulations. So we write regulations, we write policy, we advise on the interpretation of regulations, policy, law, and guidance. And we also support our permit processors in the field, make sure that they have the tools and information they need to make clear and consistent decisions for people that are requesting permits. So for context, I do want to give you some overview of the two laws that I work with, because both it'll help give you a sense of where I am coming from. And also, I feel like understanding the law that you are working with is really important to understanding, excuse me, the policy and regulations that you're working with. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and I put the citation there just in case it is helpful for you after to take a look at how the regulations and laws work together. But it is a really all-encompassing law that is very broad, but also not very detailed. It is from over 100 years ago in 1918. And it implements 4 treaties that we have. So Canada, Mexico, Japan, and Russia have all entered into a treaty with the United States to protect migratory birds. It's over 1,100 species of birds. People often get tripped up on the word migratory, but it actually protects almost all of the native birds in the United States. And that is everything from the Pacific Islands to Alaska to the Northeast and the Caribbean islands. It has really extensive prohibitions. It prohibits the possession, so having birds in hand. It prohibits any type of sale, and it prohibits any type of take. And take is used to define anything that is trapping, killing, or injuring migratory birds, as well as a number of other things similar to that. And again, it regulates a really wide range of activities. Anything that is going to involve killing a bird, trapping a bird, or having a bird in hand. And that includes a live bird, a dead bird, a nest, an egg, something that's made from a bird part, whether or not it's wild, whether or not it's native, it gets very broad. So we regulate science, research, wildlife damage, taxidermy, import, export, falconry, zoos, breeding, all kinds of things fall under that law. The Eagle Act is kind of an opposite side, which makes it a nice contrast. It has been around since the 1940s, but became a lot more prominent in 2009. The bald eagle was originally on the endangered species list, was delisted. And so all of a sudden, this rule became important, this law became important to protect this recently recovered species. So where the MBTA is broad, the Eagle Act is oddly specific in weird places. So it has the same prohibitions, it covers similar things, but the law says very specific things like to protect livestock or to ensure indigenous use or to ensure access by science and museums. And you'll see a little bit as I talk on how that difference makes a difference in how we can write our regulations. So while this may seem common sense, I'm always surprised to find that people forget that there is a hierarchy to what our laws, regulations, and policy can do. So I want to take a minute to talk about that. There's different enforcement strength as well as different speed at which these can be created. And so I'm going to dive into the differences really quick about law, regulation, policy, and guidance. I'll try to minimize a US government lecture, but I also realize that, again, the context in which I sit makes a big difference in what it is that we can do. So there's 3 branches of the US government, and our laws are written by the legislative branch. So a whole different branch of government is who is in charge of writing the laws that we need to abide by. And the law is the strongest piece of writing that we have to work with. It's the purpose of it is to give purpose and scope to the behavior that they want those under the authority of the US government to do. And then after it writes that law, it passes the authority to implement that law to a different branch of government, and that is the executive branch, which is under the US president. So the branch that I sit in is the executive branch, and we write the regulation and policy, but we get handed the scope and purpose from the legislative branch. And that is a very hard sideboard. We have to work within the scope of that law. There's often space for interpretation as to what was meant, especially as we get these older laws where they are less specific and there weren't, the lawmakers are no longer around to explain what was intended. But the words of the law really are the hard sideboards that regulations must be written within. With that, I find it's really helpful when regulation writing to start with why was this law created? It really helps shape and understand what came before and then also where you can go from there. And again, let me use the Migratory Treaty Act and the Eagle Act to show the 2 differences here. So the Migratory Bird Treaty Act came about because of overharvest. There was too much hunting, so too much harvesting for fashion purposes. Putting them in hats was a very popular trend in the late 1800s. And so many shorebirds and other bird species were rapidly declining for fashion purposes. And I always like to remind the good scientists on the phone that overharvesting for science was also one of the reasons that there was a decline. Especially rare egg collection was a huge market. And these species that had, a single egg per year or not even per year were being harvested so that the eggs could be blown out and put on display. So the foundation of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act really is to protect against overharvest. And it was really then focused on what do you have in possession? What is in your hand that I can prove that you took from the wild? and it had a very strong enforcement focus. It came from a history of how can I enforce that you took this out of the wild in a way that is not okay. It doesn't, as a result, address many modern day threats to birds, such as energy development. It's not silent, it's just silent, which leaves a lot of space for interpretation. That is good in some ways. There's lots of space for interpretation. And so the agency has latitude to say, hey, we think it's interpreted this way. The problem is it's also others have lots of latitude to challenge and say, no, you don't have that authority. And so that ambiguity makes it challenging while also giving us some space to make good choices. The Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act, there was a real tension with that law between the nation's symbol, the bald eagle, and then the fact that raptors were really considered vermin. They were predators of livestock and wildlife and things to be removed from the environment so that they didn't hurt people or hurt our interests. And so there was a real tension in that law between those two views, views of eagles. There's also, for us, had a real tension with the growing recognition of indigenous rights and how important those two species were to the Native American people. And so you see that in the law, that there's some very specific language of, you can take eagles to protect livestock, and you can take eagles for Native American purposes, which is helpful. But it also created the question of, because it is so specific in some places, does the silence mean where it's silent that we can or can't do those things? One of the things you always hear about interpreting laws is the silence where they say nothing. Do you interpret that as yes, you can, or do you interpret that as no, you can't? And with the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act, because it was so specific, there was a lot of question with that. Fortunately for us, with the delisting of the bald eagle, the public really expected us to take on incidental take protection, and wind energy development fell into that. And so instead of having to say, yes, we have the authority to do that, there was already an expectation of that. So it really became a conversation of how do we best balance industry growth with eagle conservation. One other thing I'll just say briefly is that when you're working with a law, there are other laws that overlap, and you need to think about what those are. We have two that are very common. One is the Endangered Species Act. So a bird can be protected by both Migratory Bird Treaty Act and the Endangered Species Act. And so we have to think about that. Another one that is really, I'll bring up an example for in a minute, so I just wanted to have it up here, is the Airborne Hunting Act. And that is a rule or law that protects birds from being even harassed, hazed, disturbed by aircraft. And I'll be using that in a minute. The other sets of laws here are laws that influence your process. So we have two laws. One is the National Environmental Policy Act, which requires environmental review of anything that the government does. And then another one is the Administrative Procedures Act, which governs our procedures and processes that we have to follow. So those laws influence what we do by providing policies and procedures that we are supposed to follow when we are doing rulemaking. For us, our greatest chance of having litigation is to come from not following those processes. And so it's important for us to know what those processes are. So regulation steps down from law. Regulation takes these broad ideas from the law and fills in the details on how the American public, in our case, is supposed to implement the rule and how our enforcement is supposed to enforce the rule. The agency has the ability to change and create regulations. But it is important to remember that this time scale is years. And that makes a difference in what you put in the regulation when your time scale that you are looking at is years instead of weeks or months. And so, or in the case of law, often decades. And for the US, we do have a public comment requirement. And so that's a little bit what I will talk about as well as we go on. We have two sets of regulations. Again, if you just want to see what our regulations look like, that is what the citations are for. But it is, again, Migratory Bird Treaty Act, very focused on the individual bird. It's things like I need to shoot a bird to protect aircraft that are landing at an airport. I need to shoot a bird to protect my crops. I need to trap a bird to conduct research. It's very focused on having a bird in hand. This makes rulemaking for incidental take, something like wind energy development, complex for us because the law is so broad. There's still questions as to whether or not we have the legal authority, and if so, to what extent to create those regulations. It's a different question than the Eagle Act, which really, at this point, the public, agrees that we have the authority to regulate wind energy and incidental take. So I want to just touch briefly on the other side of the spectrum, which is policy and guidance. So in the middle, regulation is sandwiched between law, very hard sideboards, and then policy and guidance, which tend to be soft sideboards or really just information sharing. There are many ways to properly execute a regulation, and so policy helps provide interpretations on how to implement those regulations. That can either be for the agency that wrote the regulation, it can be for other agency employees, or it can be for the regulated community. It does things like defining terms that might have an inconsistent interpretation. It could apply the regulation to a new emerging situation. For example, with us, that Airborne Hunting Act example, the Airborne Hunting Act was written in the 1970s and really intended for fixed wing aircraft. But recently, drones, unmanned aircraft systems, have become really popular, and the government decided that drones are considered aircraft. And so suddenly this law that has been fairly narrow for decades became very relevant with the use of drones for recreational use, as well as research, as well as even used to haze and harass birds away from things where people don't want them. Golf courses is a common place where you'll see drones to haze birds off of the golf course. Policy can be created faster and kept more current, but it also tends to be less enforceable. And so you have to be thoughtful about what you put in regulation and what you put in policy between information sharing quickly versus the enforceability. If you are the agency that writes the regs and are writing the policy about those regs, it is a good practice to eventually incorporate that policy into your regulations as soon as that is feasible. There are lots of examples of guidance. Guidance is a very broad word. It can be anything from more official guidance documents to technical resources, frequently asked questions, standard procedures, and guidance can be fairly expedient to write. You can get it very quickly, but the important thing to remember for us about guidance is that the regulation is what the requirement is. And if anybody can meet that regulation without following the guidance, that is generally still seen as following the regulation. And so you can't enforce somebody who finds a different way to meet the regulation than what the guidance says. The burden of proof is on the person that chooses to deviate from that guidance. So they need to show that they are meeting that regulatory standard, but it does mean that you're just providing input on a way to get to the regulatory requirements, not actually having the enforceability of the regulation. Okay, so with that, let's dive in to how I like to approach regulation writing. I start with trying to incentivize a desired behavior. I start with what behavior it is that you want to incentivize, and really come to the enforcement as a secondary. One of the examples, and I'll go into more detail about this, but an example of this that really struck home for me was that trying to figure out, we were working with power line industry and trying to find common ground. And for us, our goal is to have fewer eagles electrocuted by power lines. That's what's good for eagle conservation. For the power line industry, whether or not they care about eagle conservation, eagle electrocutions are bad for their business. Eagle electrocutions disrupt power delivery, which is not good for people who need their power. It means less money to the company because they're not paying, the people are not paying for power. And you also are not getting, you also have to pay to fix the line. And then they also are trying to attract wind energy, data centers, other things, these big energy uses. And those entities, those companies will look at what is the power delivery reliability before I choose where to build my location. And so whether or not the power line company cares about eagle conservation, many do, but irrespective of that, it's bad for them to have eagle electrocutions. And so if we start from a place of we all agree eagle electrocutions are bad for whatever reason, and we're trying to incentivize fewer electrocutions, this becomes a relationship where we have common ground and are working together to find solutions. We have before really approached this from an enforcement angle of no eagle electrocutions, and it was a very adversarial relationship. There was a lot of fighting over what standards are possible to achieve or what are financially able to meet. There was a lot of work to prove that what we were asking was unreasonable. And so all of the energy was put into us trying to come up with something and them fighting what that was, as opposed to when we switched that to working towards common solutions. Hey, we both agree we need to reduce this. It really helped us find a path forward together and a more lasting solution. So incentivizing behavior, how to get there. Consider what the purpose of this rule is. What do you want everyone to do? And then how do you develop a structure to encourage good actors to do that desired behavior? And then look at who are your bad actors and what are the undesired behaviors, and does this prevent those as well? But again, that's the second step, not the place that you're starting from. So here's a quick example. Say the best thing would be if wind developers put their turbines where they're not likely to have bird collisions, where there's a low risk to bird collisions. How could we possibly get them there? And that could be things like reducing the regulatory burden. Never underestimate the power of saying you don't have to come talk to the government. Man, that is one of the most compelling solutions you have out there, is if you do it this way, you don't have to talk to me. That really gets some incentivized behavior more than anything else. You can provide information, like we'll provide a risk map. Here is us sharing with you the information we have as to where it is that you can do good things. Many companies just want to do the good things, but don't have the information to make informed choices. You can also reduce costs. If you do it this way, you owe less to the government, or even that the government will pay you to do it this way. And so financial numbers are often another motivator, but there's many possible solutions to incentivize, but I encourage you to think very broadly as to what those might be when you're starting out on the regulation writing. So I like to always go to innovation and common sense. I try to find innovative approaches. How can we get there in a way that we haven't before? But I also want to make sure it's common sense. It's easy to get too innovative and too creative, so much so that it is confusing. And so is this common sense? Is this a reasonable approach? So To get there, when possible, I like to start with a blank page approach. If just assume that there's nothing that has gone before, what is the behavior that I want to incentivize? How are the ways that I can get there? And then look at some of the restrictions. How is that limited based on my logs? Also, how is that limited by practical considerations? Is it feasible? Is it financially viable? I have on here also political feasibility. That is both internal politics to your agency as well as those that you're working with. We often have things of, well, that's just a deal breaker for a particular community, and so we just have to remove that option. But I really encourage critically examining each limitation and why it's a limitation before you accept that limitation, because often, more often than not, we place limitations on ourselves that aren't really there, or that there's another way to get to the same endpoint. I like to start conversations with, if you had a magic wand, what would this look like? It gets people out of where it is that they normally start from and encourages them to be really creative as what their wildest wishes would be. And it's amazing, people often don't share that when you just ask them what it is that they want. But if you put it in a more whimsical way, then they tend to share, well, this is what their dream is. And it's amazing how many times you can get to that if you just knew what it was. I'm smiling at Todd here because there's many times Todd has come to me and said, Jennifer, I want to do this. How do I get here? And we can get there. But it takes the asking the question of without the constraints that you perceive in order to get there. But it also is good to consider what has gone before. What context has that worked? What context does it not work in? And look far afield to solve these problems. I call it leveling up, but if somebody, there's a lot of commonality. We have too many permits and not enough people to process them quickly. How do we solve that problem? Many others have come up with approaches to solving that problem, and you can look to others to see how they've done that. How do we create a mitigation market? Many others have created a mitigation market before we have. And so what have they learned, and what what worked and what hasn't? So definitely don't stay within your agency as to how your agency has solved problems. Look far afield, look to other countries, look to other agencies, and be creative in those solutions. This is another one I will laugh because Todd and I have talked about before, but subject matter expertise is so important to informing regulations. But subject matter experts are generally really terrible regulation writers, is the summary of this. So let me dive into it more detail. Definitely leverage experts for their knowledge. Ask them questions to help improve your understanding, improve terminology uses, identify issues, identify key stakeholders. But these are detail-oriented people. Your subject matter experts have been immersed in this topic for a long time and are very focused. They can get super overwhelmed if you ask them to make policy decisions. So their input is really critical to have a workable regulation. And it's a real neat opportunity to get buy-in from the experts in the community that your regulation will work. But framing things in well-framed trade-offs, is A or B better for birds? Is A or B better for wind? Helps them frame what they're saying in a way that shares information without putting them in the decision maker chair. For example, we have one right now. We have 1,100 bird species that we manage, and we need to find a way to make better biological decisions. And so the policy staff look at this and say, oh my gosh, we have 1,100 bird species. How can we possibly make biological decisions based on that? Our modelers, our experts in modeling bird populations, say, oh, it's very easy to break these into groups. We have some bird species that are really abundant, and we are not worried about those. We have some bird species that you guys never permit, so we don't need to worry about those. It's really this set that we need to worry about, and we could model them this way, no big deal. But oh my gosh, we can't do that because how are we going to make policy decisions? And our modelers are stuck because they get overwhelmed by, oh, the modeling is easy, but then we need to make policy decisions. And our policy decision people are saying, we need to make policy decisions, but we don't have any modeling data. And it is amazing. This project that I've now pulled into has been going on for years because they can't figure out how to get the really good subject matter expertise into policy decisions. And that's where somebody like me being brought in helps, because that's what my role is how do I take that subject matter expertise and translate it into policy? I will always be amazed at how much that is overwhelming to both sides. The policy decision makers get overwhelmed by data. The subject matter experts get overwhelmed by decisions. So set them up for success is the short version of that. I really like to use what's called a snowball method, which means you think about something small and you big it builder and builder by adding snow until you have what is considered saturated, or you're not getting any other new information when you build your snowball. So you identify key experts, you ask them the information that you're seeking. You ask them what else would you share, ask them to share what it is that maybe you're forgetting to ask. And then you ask them to identify other experts that you think that they think might be helpful to this effort. And this approach helps give access to people that are otherwise difficult to access. You have people in your expert community that have niche skills that you can really leverage the networks of those people and gather buy-in by saying, okay, here's some key experts. What do you know? And who else do you know that I should talk to? It can create some blind spots. So you need to think about who is not represented in that expert group. And sometimes just asking, who are the people that are going to have opinions who aren't at this table can help identify that. I like to also do this approach in small groups. So having 2 or 3 together helps that group talk together in a very usually collegial manner and build off of each other. And I find that really works well. If you get too big of a group, you get people who stop contributing because they think somebody else is saying what they're thinking or just don't want to speak up. One-on-one can be super helpful also, and help calibrate, help identify new experts. But there is something added value when you bring a smaller group together to be able to talk together and bounce ideas off of each other. So again, just starting with a few key, asking them to identify other experts and other information, and just keep building. And at some point you're like, okay, I'm not getting anything new at this point, and so I have what I need to go forward. You can always circle back once you have something and say, okay, here is what I have. This is working, and see what your experts think. Subject matter expert input, I feel like is so very valuable and often not given enough attention. So I do just want to emphasize the value of this. I see subject matter expert input different than stakeholder engagement. In the US, there is a real emphasis on making sure that everybody has a voice to contribute to the rulemaking process. We have a very big public comment opportunity for people to share their input on our regulations. And so engaging stakeholders in a meaningful way helps make sure that that public comment process goes well as ensuring you have a really good rule. So you need to identify your stakeholders, the goals of engaging stakeholders, because that does shape your stakeholder process, and then designing the process based on those goals. So is the goal to gather subject matter expertise? Is it to ensure you have a transparent process? Is it to get your stakeholders to have buy-in on what the outcome of your regulation is. Those goals all require slightly different processes, and there's a whole wealth of literature on stakeholder engagement that I'm not going to dive into, but I do really want to just emphasize the goals shape the process, and so make sure you know what you're trying to get out of that stakeholder engagement. There's also a wide range of different stakeholders. That can be government agencies, the regulated community, non-governmental organizations, especially in the United States, we have indigenous communities, and also the general public. The different timing, so depending on your goal, there'll be different timing for stakeholder engagement. And there's also different timing, whether it's a government organization in the United States or whether it's non-government. So if we are engaging government, we can do that earlier in the process. If we're engaging non-government, we can do that later in the process. So again, know what your processes are. I also encourage in the stakeholder engagement to look for unexpected allies. For example, there are many places where people may not have the incentive to conserve birds, but they still have incentive to do the behavior that results in conserving birds. Again, I'm going to use that power line industry example. Electrocutions are bad for power delivery, whether or not they're concerned about electrocuting eagles. And so we actually have an ally there in trying to find a workable solution. There are very sometimes uncommon or unexpected groups that can come together because they do have a common goal. And so look out for those and leverage them where it makes sense. So there are trade-offs in stakeholder engagement. The more engagement, the slower the process, but the more buy-in. And so you need to think about what is most important. Is it speed, or is it getting everybody to come along with the decision making? Consider what is gained by slowing down and what is lost. You can identify a point in which information has kind of hit what we call a critical mass, that additional time doesn't actually result in more information and more buy-in. And so kind of have to find that space. And the one that I think I just want to stress for stakeholder engagement that is often lost is what I call closing the loop. But it's to take the time to let stakeholders know that they've been heard. We heard your input. This is how we considered your input, and this is the outcome of that. It never ceases to amaze me how much being heard is more important, not more important, but almost as important as having their approach be the one that goes forward. People are generally very willing to accept if you have to go a different direction, if you take the time to explain, we heard you, we considered you, but we have to take a different approach. And so taking the time, often as regulation writers, we got all of our information, we're focused on writing, we're focused on moving the rule forward, and we forget to come back and say, I'm going to pick on Todd here again because he's here, but say, hey, Todd, thanks for your input. It made a huge difference in the rules that we were working on, and it was really valuable, and we took it into consideration, and here's how we used it. That goes a long way. By the way, Todd, thanks. So for writing regulations, when you get to the actual pen to paper, the two keys here are keeping the right level of detail and remembering your audience. There is currently in the United States a cultural preference for highly specific regulations. People want every possible piece of information in these regulations, and it's causing problems. And so let me talk through how I help find balance. The first question that I ask, whenever somebody comes in with I send a draft out, people take a look at it and have a question about it. The first thing I say is, can I fix this by saying less words? There's always the desire of, oh, let me just explain further. Let me put more words in here. When you put more words in, then it creates, again, that situation of this is very detailed right here, but this situation we didn't think about. And so is that included because it's not said, or is it excluded because it's not said? One of the classic ones is people want to start listing out examples. So, you know, you have to, one of the ones we have right now is you have to abide by other laws. And then they want to say the endangered species law, the historic preservation law, the pesticide use law, and they start listing them out. And that actually causes problems because if it's not listed, say there's a new law, you know, a law on protecting fish that we didn't talk about, is that included? Because it's, you know, you didn't put it in your list. So what am I supposed to do with that? And so often in regulation, taking that level of detail out makes a clearer regulation. And then you can use your policy and guidance to say, hey, by the way, we meant all of these laws for sure. And if there's new ones that come up, we mean those too. So always first start with, can I edit this down? Again, don't make those regulations overly prescriptive. Policy and guidance can fill in those gaps. And so be careful about the tendency to want to add more detail to try and make things more clear. Regulations will never keep pace with emerging science, technology, and issues. They will be always behind. That's a sad fact, but it's a true fact. And if you accept it, then you can write smarter regulations than thinking, oh, I'm sure I can keep this updated. And I'll get to performance standards in just a minute, but performance standards are a great tool to be able to write regulations where the goal doesn't change, but the ways that you might meet that goal could change over time as science and technology come forward. I will just make a note too, again, about selecting the right team for the job. Regulation writing requires generalizing and lumping things together. People that are hyper-specific can easily get overwhelmed by the amount of information that needs to be synthesized for regulation writing. It's important that they understand what they're writing about and that they're dedicated, but people that are very passionate about a topic can actually be a hindrance because they can have blind spots to what it is that they are writing about. And also, no one person is to, excuse me. No one person is good at the entirety of regulation writing. Skills are very different for writing reg text versus communicating and outreaching to the public versus decision making. And so having a team can really help with your regulation writing. For your audience, it's tempting to write for NGOs or your supervisors or the industry, but really regulations should be written for those who are being regulated. Who is it that is going to be the regulated community? And make things easy to find, use patterns in how you write, and keep your sections small so that it's easy to reference those. So really focusing on that. And then the preamble, that's the portion for us that goes in front of the actual regulation text when we publish it, that explains what it is that we do. And the preamble, I really like, I was told once to write for who is my successor 20 years from now. How do I explain the decisions that I made to who I am in 20 years? And I find that really gets the audience to what it is that you want to describe in that preamble. Definitely make sure concerns of industry NGO supervisors are addressed, but they are not your primary audience. You should write the text with that audience in mind. One just general point here is that people want choices. This might be partially cultural, but I suspect it holds true elsewhere. Having a firm boundary, people will push against it. If it regulated community will say it's too restricted, the conservation community will say it's not protective enough. And so having hard boundaries just creates something for push against. Whereas if you give choices, it relieves some of that tension. They can be limited choices. They don't all have to be equal choices. If you build your wind project here, you don't need to talk to the government. You don't need to pay any money. But if you put it here, you have to talk to the government and pay lots of money, but you can choose where you want to put it. That creates more flexibility than a firm boundary of no, you cannot build here. The performance standard approach is one of my favorite approaches. It really establishes a threshold requirement expectation that must be met at a particular level. However, it does not prescribe the means of getting to that requirement. So performance standards, oh, sorry, I just backed that up. The law provides the purpose, the regulation sets the standards, and then the policy and guidance provides the examples. But really, we're looking at how do we set those standards. Our goal is to communicate an expectation without limiting innovation. So I'm going to go through a couple examples here on performance standards. This one was one that really woke me up to the performance standard approach of we had a very clear, prescriptive, you must install. So we had these pits that had oil in them, and it was to protect birds from getting in there. And it was, you must install netting that must be like this and installed this way with this size and this material, and was super specific. And it made it so that good actors couldn't meet the standard and bad actors said, I'm not even trying. And so instead, rewriting that so that we just said, hey, you have to exclude birds from contacting the surface. However you want to do that is up to you. Helps inspire innovation, helps inspire them to come up with new ways of doing things that still meet the expectations of what it is that we need to do. Another one was very prescriptive survey methods. You must survey by walking these transects and conducting activities on these dates in this manner. And it really created so many questions coming in. Well, oh no, we had winter weather, so we can't make the surveys on January 15th. What do we do? And so to try and prevent all of these special use cases, if you just raise it up a level to, you have to come up with a protocol. You must survey at least once per season. You must detect at this rate. It helps everybody find a way that is workable to them to find that solution. Another one was, this one was bird flight diverters. And bird flight diverters don't always work at reducing collisions. And then I was told by an engineer, this is the difference between biologists and engineers, right? The biologists were like, okay, we need bird flight diverters on our power lines. And an engineer told me, well, to put them in, I have to hang from a helicopter over a river, over a high power wire. And I have to try and put these on, and the wind is so bad in this area that they're going to blow to the side immediately. And so so it was not a good risk for human life. It wasn't a good risk for birds even, because it wasn't going to add value. And so again, raising that up a level to say, if you have a bird collision, you need to implement methods to reduce those collisions, and leaving it to them to be able to come up with approaches that are workable for both the biologists and the engineers out there. So a few last points here. It's important to write from a place of incentivization, but be sure regulations are enforceable. Lawyers are important advisors. Again, our branches, the legislative branch writes the laws, the executive branch writes the regulations. Our courts help decide interpretation in that judicial branch, and lawyers are really important custodians of that legal information. But they can help with, is this a reasonable interpretation? What would be the risk of this approach? Of these three approaches, what has the least legal risk? Heed their advice, take their comments, but lawyers are also very bad regulation writers. They can see every possible perspective, and it will get you stuck. And so be thoughtful in how you seek their advice. They're valuable perspectives, but it's very hard to get a straight answer. And so be thoughtful in how you solicit that input. Likewise, for law enforcement, they will immediately read from a bad actor perspective. This is really valuable input to have somebody read your regulations from how would I get away with something, and seeking their input early can help make sure that you identify pitfalls in your regulations that others don't see. Seek their input on regulatory text that others won't be able to catch. We want to ensure that your rule is enforceable, but in our current state, it is tempting to prioritize enforcement. And if you go that far, you tend to lose support from your good actors, and people will just get frustrated and say, I can't possibly achieve this. Information collection is the last bit here. And I want you to just for information collection, consider what you need to make a decision, what you need to make your rule sure your rule is sound, but resist the urge to collect everything. So there's information collection on your application. There's information collection for your reports. There's information collection that is very personal to people. It can be people's names and other like addresses, things like that. And so you want to be thoughtful. Do I really need this information to make a decision? Or do I really need this information to evaluate the program? Information collection requires balance. Your permit processors and subject matter experts are detail-focused staff. They will encourage you to collect every piece of possible information that is out there. But consider, do you really need that information to make a decision? There is a cost to people providing information, whether that's time, whether that's sharing personal information or company information. In the US, that information that is shared is public. And so make sure that you're thoughtful about that. One last little bit here. Briefing supervisors can be the most difficult part of this. Finding the right level of detail is really key. They want to make sure that they know the reasonable range of alternatives, that you're presenting a practical approach, that you've considered and minimized potential issues, but definitely avoid being overly detailed. I always say, think about telling a spouse or a parent or a child what it is that you do. Have layers of detail beyond that, but don't start with that because it is easy to get overwhelmed. You are now the expert on this regulation, and if you share all of your expertise, it can be overwhelming and lead to more questions that don't need to be brought up. One that, for example, was, well, how are you going to let current applicants know that the rule changed? And so we explained, oh, well, we have a letter that we're going to share to the current applicants. And so, but then also have other layers ready, right? So I was anticipating the question, well, what does that letter look like? And I can say, oh, we're going to use the same one that we used in 2016, and it provides information for people to make a decision that's good for them. And then I also secretly have hidden that I've already drafted the letter and have a template ready to go. I don't start with that because then you get into a level of detail you don't want to necessarily engage in. But when people ask, I have it ready. And so they feel confident that I've thought through this issue and we can just move on. All right, so 4 just big lessons that I feel like I've learned is that this process is much slower than I ever expected. And so if you push too hard, you will get really tired from making no progress. But if you're too patient, change never comes. So continue, to recognize this is a long process, be determined, but also be patient. The other thing I learned is that delays sometimes are really important. There are many times when a regulation I have been working on has been delayed, and it has been really frustrating. But a new opportunity actually came up. Something really important happened during that delay that improves my regulation and makes it better. And so seek those opportunities while things are delayed to find ways to make improvements. And rather than getting frustrated with those delays, I can't tell you how many times it has been a better product because of an unexpected delay through things that you just never would expect. Also, don't waste energy being frustrated about what is out of your sphere of control. For me right now, it's those above me. It leaves my desk and it goes for very long periods of time to other people, my superiors. And so it's hard to not get frustrated about that. It's easy to waste a lot of energy in what is outside the law, outside your scope, outside your ability to control. And so make sure you focus on what it is that you do have the ability to control. And then I am always one to be prepared to capitalize on an opportunity. I know what the next steps are. I know different ways to approach a problem. I have them sitting in the back of my head. And so when an opportunity presents, I can capitalize on it. I can take advantage of that. Opportunities show up in very unexpected places at unexpected times. And if you're prepared for those, it's amazing how fast you can move things in really positive directions. So be on the lookout for those situations to come up, and you can move things a lot quicker than you're expecting sometimes, or in really awesome, great directions. All right, so with that, I'm on to questions. Can I be of help?
Jennifer, thank you so much. That was fantastic and a really unique perspective on writing regulations and interpreting laws. There were some questions or thoughts in the chat during your presentation, and I think we answered some of them. Do people have other questions or thoughts they would? You're welcome to write them in the chat or raise your hand. That's okay. Jennifer, how you have the perspective that you have is obviously developed from working in the US government. I think some of the questions that people were talking about were implementing these things in Central Asia. What of this do you think could go directly to Central Asia, and what do you think would need a lot of sort of adjusting to make it fit? And I know you don't know Central Asia well, so it's difficult, but
yeah, so my experience is more with government in Africa than with Central Asia, but I'll maybe just use that as my parallel of what seems to be universal government versus what seems to be cultural US. I think the understanding that bureaucracy is slow seems to be universal. Understanding that how to gather information and how to share information seems to be, there's some cultural differences there, but really making sure that you have people who can gather the subject matter expertise, synthesize that into something that is culturally readable, and then again, present it back in a way that is understandable is a really critical skill. And understanding to look for those people, maybe not even with biology degrees, it's a different skill set, and bridging that type way is a different skill set. I think a lot of the best management practices, it sounds like you'll be in the next lecture, and a lot of the really the performance standards can translate in many ways. And so taking a look, unfortunately, my regulations at this point are not quite where I was hoping for this lecture, so my ability to share details is limited, but I would encourage to stay tuned. Maybe by the next lecture, I can even give you something to share, Todd, for us for Eagles and Wind, but how we really give some concrete examples of how we are approaching that, and what those performance standards are, and then what the guidance is about how those performance standards can be met. I think some of those obviously are local, but the infrastructure and birds interacting with the infrastructure, there's definitely some consistency there that is not just US based. And so taking a look this is a off the wall example too, but like for us, we're looking at exhibition, so birds in captivity regulations. Australia is doing some really great work, and so we are borrowing how they are framing their standards from the Australian approach. And so I think there's a lot more that we could do cross-nationally than we do right now. We tend to be very focused on solving it within our own countries.
Yeah.
Jennifer, I have a question. In the absence of laws, do you think that a country like Kazakhstan or other Central Asian countries, maybe the best they could do until they get some of these laws established is to work with wind energy developers in implementing best management practices that other countries have come up with?
Yeah, I feel like there's two pieces, right? The law really provides enforcement, but it's always surprising to me how many entities really want to do a good thing and just don't know. The information sharing in a clear way is so key, and you can do that without laws for sure. That's really what we're at right now with incidental take for migratory birds too, without having a clear regulation on the books. And so doing the work of finding here is how you can approach it, and sharing information in a clear and consistent manner through guidance can definitely, a lot of people will get on board with that. The other real advantage to that is that you get some standards out there, you get feedback on those in an informal way, right? Here's what we recommend for wind energy to do. Wind energy will say, okay, you'll see what is it that they pick up, what is it that they don't, what works, what doesn't. And then you can, adjust. It gives you kind of a proofreading period, right? And so then when it is an opportunity to do a law, you can say, hey, look, most of wind is already doing this anyway. And it's not as hard for lawmakers to get buy-in on a law because it's what's already being done. It's already, many people have adopted that approach, as opposed to something brand new can be much more overwhelming. So the more you can get some of these practices in place in an informal way, the easier it is for those laws to come forward, for sure. And I would encourage, I didn't put this in my reference, but the one example that the US had of that is the APLIC guidelines for electrocuting birds, Avian Power Line Interaction Committee. But that was, again, we didn't have the regulations, so we developed a joint guidance document, and industry has been implementing that. And as a result, now we have a much more positive working relationship based on that. That might be a good resource to share, if not already.
Great, thank you.
So a reminder for everybody that the last lecture in our series, Jill and I will be speaking on best management practices and highlighting some of the lessons from Jennifer's talk and all the other talks. And hopefully we can also do some extensive question and answer and have a discussion. Yeah, thank you very much, Jennifer. That was really a cool topic and something unique. Jill, anything else?
I would like to thank you too, Jennifer. I think that in Central Asian countries, obviously, there's a lot that can be learned from the US, but of course, there needs to be give and take as to what their restrictions are on getting those, some laws passed. But hopefully that dialogue can continue, that, ACBK and maybe the US Embassy will continue to work on some collaborative effort. I just want to say one more thing, that the last talk also will have a brief new material on mapping. Some participants from past lectures wanted some more information on how to start mapping sensitive areas and the effect of wind energy development. So there will be a bit of new information in the last lecture as well, but we hope to have a question and answer session too that addresses all of the previous, I guess it's 7 lectures. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for having me here, and I really appreciate it. This is something that I'm really passionate about and happy to help. And as I said, I think, taking some of this information about how to get regulations and laws at the right level of detail, I really think can make sense going forward. And I know our program, and we have somebody going to Uzbekistan here soon as well. And so we're trying to engage more with Central Asian countries and are happy to help, whatever that looks like for sure. Please feel free to reach out.
Excellent. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.